Sophie Turner is definitely making waves in Hollywood. She started out her acting career with a massive hit series, Game of Thrones. But Game of Thrones is done and it makes you wonder what she's up to now. Sophie nabbed the lead role in the 2019 Dark Phoenix movie, where she'll once again play Jean Grey, just like she did in the 2016 X-Men Apocalypse movie. Can she make the move from Sansa Stark to Jean Grey? Keep on watching to find out. From Winterfell to Xavier's school. When the world was introduced to Sansa Stark in Game of Thrones, the actress behind the now famous name was only a young teenager. Sophie joined the Game of Thrones cast at around 14 years old, and after about a year of shooting, the first season premiered on HBO. Back then, Sophie was quite literally a fresh face, both in the acting scene and in real life. The series, which turned into a worldwide phenomenon, was her first television role ever. Sophie, like the other young cast members of Game of Thrones, ended up growing on screen alongside her character Sansa. Growing up on set and surrounded by other talented actors had its pros and cons, but growing up as Sansa Stark proved to be a challenge as well. And it also led viewers to wonder if they can see Sophie Turner as anyone else besides Sansa. Sophie's been Sansa for 8 years. While the show was ongoing, Sophie had a couple of other roles in indie films, but most of her time was devoted to being Sansa. We're left asking, can she break free from the red-headed Sansa and nail other roles? The end of Sophie's time as Sansa Stark was hard to accept. Sophie admitted that because she spent almost half her life playing the character, letting go was like experiencing the death of a loved one. She told British Vogue that she had to grieve for Sansa and cried for hours after the season wrapped. As the production for the final season of Game of Thrones came to a close, Sophie felt a bit of an existential crisis. She tells the New York Times, quote, "I started to think, who am I without it?" End quote. She felt like she didn't have an identity, which makes total sense considering she pretty much spent most of her life in an iconic role. She said that the time after Game of Thrones ending was a big healing moment for her. And it looks like now she can really move on, even though it's definitely hard to shake off typecasting and only be known for a single role. Game of Thrones is a massive franchise with a controversial finale, but it left many wondering if it's going to be hard for GOT actors to top such an iconic show. Luckily, Sophie managed to get another famous gig on her resume, X-Men Dark Phoenix. In the movie, Sophie is starring as Jean Grey. Critics and fans alike have not been so kind to some of the X-Men films in the past, which puts a lot of pressure on Sophie, and the extra pressure comes from her fans who saw her grow up on the Game of Thrones. There's no doubt her performances will be watched closely, but Sophie is looking ahead with hope and growth in mind. She described her time in Game of Thrones as secondary school, while Dark Phoenix is more like going to university. It's a test to see how much she's learned from her days in Winterfell. Is it enough to succeed at Xavier's school for gifted youngsters? Parallels between Sansa and Jean. Sophie Turner's got 2 major roles under her belt, Sansa Stark in Game of Thrones and now Jean Grey in Dark Phoenix. It looks like a challenge to break out of her iconic past role and into her next one, but there are still definitely similarities between Sansa and Jean. Jean Grey is a telekinetic and telepathic human mutant with red hair. She's more powerful than people think, herself included. And then there's Sophie, who is a natural blonde, but we've gotten quite used to her rocking a red do. After all, Sansa Stark is also a redhead. And let's not forget that she's also pretty tough, even though she doesn't really realize it first. Sophie used to dye her hair red for Game of Thrones, but started wearing wigs in season 7. It might have been because she partnered with hair color brand Wella Hair as their global brand ambassador. But at least everyone's already had time to get used to Sophie with red hair, so that's one less thing to adjust to. In an interview with IGN, Sophie noticed that there were parallels between characters Sansa and Jean. She reckons that these parallels are why they got her to play the main role in the movie. For one, Sophie suggests that the X-Men team might have been the dark side of Sansa, and were reminded of Jean Grey. Sansa's been run through the ringer, though she had her beginnings as a naive girl with romantic dreams of being queen. It's safe to say that both Jean and Sansa have a dark side to them. Sophie also notes Jean's struggle with power, which will be explored more deeply in the upcoming movie. She says Jean also feels quite misunderstood and rejected as a mutant in the human world. She likens this to Sansa, who she claims felt the same way. Sophie says that Sansa, quote, really wanted to be a normal princess/queen and live a normal life, end quote, but couldn't because of the consequences. Sophie is playing the younger version of the popular Jean Grey, who was actually portrayed by several actresses in the past. But one parallel between Sophie's characters falls on the negative. Sansa Stark got a lot of criticism and hate from fans of the show. Fortunately, it wasn't mostly because of Sophie's acting skills. It was more of because of how her character was written. But Sophie would still be the target of hate because she's the face of Sansa. The controversial series finale of Game of Thrones was so divisive that it led to a petition from fans asking the writers to redo the ending. Even though it's out of any of the cast members' hands, Sophie still felt the fans' rage. Dealing with hate from the public is a challenge anyone in the limelight will face, but for Sophie, it could be more intense than usual. Game of Thrones had a massive fan base and went on longer than the books it was based on. It was a recipe for a fan-made uproar. The X-Men film franchise is similar, as comic book fans are admittedly hard to please. And when movies fall short, the actors behind the characters are usually the ones who are punished first. Past X-Men films haven't always done so great. X-Men Apocalypse got a 47% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. While some fans and critics enjoyed it as a campy superhero flick featuring an incredibly star-studded cast, it wasn't well received for the most part. With Dark Phoenix coming up, Sophie has a lot to brace herself for if it doesn't impress. Luckily, she's no stranger to rabid fans. Growing up Sansa. Before we go talk more about how Sophie moves forward for her role as the Dark Phoenix, let's take a step back. How would you handle growing up in Winterfell? For Sophie Turner, life as Sansa was a little more than just fiction on TV. She played the role for 8 seasons, or almost 9 years. Her time going through puberty was spent alongside her characters. Sophie was playing one of the most popular roles today while dealing with zits, low self-esteem, and body image problems, all while being in the public eye. Growing up Sansa may sound fun and exciting. It's definitely a blessing many other young actresses only wish they could have, but it wasn't easy for Sophie. She admits she never really got used to being in the spotlight so often and on such a large scale. Even the Jonas Brothers music video for Sucker, which starred Sophie, Priyanka Chopra, and Joe Jonas, racked up over 140 million views. That's about 4 times the average number of viewers for Game of Thrones episodes. But Sophie insists that she hates being herself in public and would, quote, rather be a character, end quote. Sansa Stark is no easy character to play, though. Her controversial and difficult experiences caused backlash from fans and critics. People hated her character and weren't afraid of letting Sophie know thanks to social media. Being subject to such scrutiny on vulnerable days also led to Sophie developing anxiety and depression. Sophie tends to look calm and collected in person or fun and quirky on videos posted online, but she's vocal about her struggles with mental health, most of which she developed from a young age. Hearing comments like, quote, Sansa gained a lot of weight, end quote, or, quote, Sansa needs to lose a few pounds, end quote, affected Sophie greatly. Thankfully, she could confide in her close friend and fellow Stark sister Maisie Williams. The two grew to be good friends as they grew up on Game of Thrones together. The two didn't have a lot of scenes together from season 2 to 7, but it may have been a blessing in disguise. Sophie described their working together to be lots of fun, but highly unproductive. But in the beginning, Sophie admits to feeling envious of Maisie. Sophie's role was frustrating, especially in the earlier seasons. She wished that her character would do more exciting things like go into battle. Sophie understood, however, that this was all necessary to show Sansa's growth over the series. In the end, it's more satisfying to see how powerful her character has become over the years. It takes a bit of sacrifice for actors to really get into the role they're playing. As with everything, some people sacrifice more than others. This time, Sophie has more luck on her side. It may have been uncomfortable, but it's definitely not the worst thing an actor has had to do for a role. To really look like Sansa had to escape King's Landing, Sophie had to skip out on washing her hair for days. The goal was to get it all grubby and dirty, just like Sansa's would be after days in the wild. At least this was a good preparation for Sophie in case the apocalypse begins. And no, we don't mean the X-Men kind. Sophie was also very lucky to be surrounded by other talented castmates while on set. She picked up a lot of acting tips just by observing her fellow cast members. Having this much first-hand exposure to talent is an edge for Sophie and could be useful in her upcoming role. Research, research, research. One of the best ways for any actor to get into their role is by researching. It's important to understand every aspect of a character, whether it's their job, their family background, or even allergies. All of these things contribute to who a character is, what they say, and what they do. When it comes to Sophie Turner, she has a lot of research ahead. She doesn't have a wide variety of roles for her acting career so far. Sansa Stark and Jean Grey have their similarities, but they're very different people at the end of the day. Sophie will have to look for other sources to really get in the head of Jean. And honestly, her head is kind of complicated. Jean Grey often hears voices, and her experiences are similar to those who are diagnosed with schizophrenia. To prepare for her role as the Dark Phoenix, Sophie confesses that she's never done more research for a role before. She devoted a lot of time reading into mental illnesses like dissociative personality disorder and schizophrenia. The director of Dark Phoenix, Simon Kinberg, handed Sophie a lot of books about such topics, including basically doing homework on schizophrenia. He also shared other materials with her to get her started on the thought process Jean goes through. All this was to understand what it's like to be Jean, whose inner struggles begin after a rescue mission in space. Sophie even learned what it was like to have auditory hallucinations, or to hear voices in your head, while trying to function normally. Sophie recognizes how complex Jean Grey is as a character and wants to do the role justice. She certainly took a step in the right direction by learning about mental illness. It's safe to say this isn't the last we'll be seeing of Sophie Turner on our big screens. We can't wait what's in store for her next. What do you guys think? Is Sophie Turner ready for different roles, or is she stuck in Game of Thrones? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you again at TheTalko.